of the Free State. I'd like to welcome those in the room and those online. Today, we have privileged to welcome Patrick Offiong-Ben. We'll be making a presentation on the topic entitled Beyond Inconsequentialism, Grounding Complementary Obligation in Collective Harm Cases. Before I continue, I'd just like to read out Ben's bio. Ben is a doctoral researcher in applied ethics and African philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. He also serves as a teaching assistant in critical thinking and introduction to ethics in the School of Social Sciences at Manchester. His research interests include collective impact problems, the problem of inconsequentialism in climate change, the theories of social and political participation, and responsive educational models. He is a research associate with the Decoloniality Research Group at the University of Pretoria and the recipient of the 2024 and 2025 European Forum Albach scholarships. Ben is not a stranger to our group here. He was a discussant sometime last year. So we're happy to have him again. Before I have him make his presentation, I would also like to introduce a discussant, Dr. Daisy Nalwamba, who's also not a stranger to our group here, was a postdoctoral research fellow here. She is an environmental and climate change scholar with over 7 years of experience in research, teaching, and policy engagement. She holds a PhD in development studies, focusing on environmental sustainability, and a Master of Science in Environmental Management. Her work spans environmental sustainability, disaster risk reduction, electronic waste governance, climate change, and early warning systems. Dr. Nalwamba has contributed to academic and practical initiatives in promoting climate justice, sustainable development, and inclusive adaptation. She is a 2025 Codestria Afra Fellow, supported by MasterCard. So thank you to our presenter as well as our discussant. So as usual, we will have Ben make a presentation for about 30 minutes. And thereafter, we'll have Dr. Nalwamba, who will give us our thoughts after that. And thereafter, we open up for questions and thoughts. At this point in time, I would like to hand over to you, Ben. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So let me share my screen now. All right, so, okay, so thank you, Paul, for the invitation, and thank you, Daisy, for agreeing to make some relevant contributions. All right, so I want to talk about the problem of inconsequentialism, and my talk is going to proceed first by trying to conceptualize the problem. What are collective impact problems generally? How do we understand it? And then also some of the major approaches to this problem. And then after that, I'll try to discuss the most significant response to this problem given by Walter Sinnott Armstrong. And then also after that, I'll show why that response is ineffective and why we need a new thesis for responding to that problems, because the question is, if other people have responded to the problem, why is an African approach necessary? And I'll try to establish that. why that response or defense of inconsequentialism is ineffective, and then how then articulate the complementary thesis for responding to the problem. And time permitting, I'll also consider three potential objections to my own thesis. All right, so what is the structure of the problem? We can think about the problem like this. When I drive my car on weekends for fun, I emit greenhouse gases, but not enough to raise the global surface temperature of the planet. However, when myself, my neighbors, my friends, people in my city, and millions of people across the world engage in similar activities together, we emit just enough greenhouse gases to cause climate change. Um, um, who's sharing the screen?
So sure what's happening. We just
I think,
Ben,
somebody interrupted. Yeah.
Ben,
Yeah.
there's a person by the name of Ben Zulu. I think
Ben Zulu, yeah, sharing the screen, so I don't know.
You unshared.
Okay.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that. So, when millions of people do this, we emit enough greenhouse gases, and then together we cause climate change. And this is what we might call a collective impact problem. And because there are certain harms that are associated with this problem, we say collective harm problems. And how do they arise? So collective harm problems arise in context where the act of different individuals together in millions generate these harmful outcomes that no single individual action can solve them. And also individuals acting together cannot generate the same effects. So we have examples in tragedy of the commons. You have climate change, you have resource depletion, air pollution, and crime, and similar outcomes. And then, given that we have a collective impact problem that arises from our individual actions, generally one might ask, how should we respond to this problem? What is the way forward? Well, we have two primary approaches to this problem. The first is the collective action approach, and then you also have the individual action approach, which is we can come together and act as a group, or we can decide to act individually. But collective action approaches are generally attractive, and people say, well, it is when we act together as a collective that we can make a significant change. And in this case, that the buck stops with states, international organizations, and multinational corporations. They are best positioned to solve the problem. There's nothing individuals can do. And then another approach says that, well, we can act as individuals and also contribute to a solution. But as attractive as collective action approaches are, they have a problem. There is something unmistakable that happens when we try to bring too many people with dissimilar interests together to solve a problem. And what happens these days, that the larger the group, the more difficult it is to coordinate actions because of the different interests that people have. So the diversity of interests is both a notable strength of collectives when we act together, and also a weakness because of ability to coordinate these different interests together and get to a solution. So given the failure of this approach, then the question is, what is an alternative? Then that is when you can think of individual actions. So, well, some say we can act as individuals, but the problem is, as an individual, I'm not going to generate enough influence. I'm not going to make a very significant influence. So it seems my actions are generally pointless. Why act in the first place if it is not going to solve the problem? I might be able to do my bit as an individual. However, it makes no difference. As an individual, I cannot change the planet. I cannot solve climate change. So why act? And this also, you can see this in various contexts like election. In a national election, for example, a single individual might say, why am I voting in election if my vote alone is not what is needed to for a particular candidate to win the election? So it makes no difference whether I vote or not, or it makes no difference whether I stop driving, I take public transport, I give up flying. It's not going to solve the problem. So to also understand this pointlessness of individual action, we call it the problem of inconsequentialism. And this is generally the understanding that individual contributions are insufficient and therefore cannot help to solve collective harm problems like climate change, resource depletion, and the likes. And to understand the size of the problem, you can also just look at this picture. So it is like telling the guy here that he should be responsible for managing a very large institution like this. It's a very difficult challenge. I'm too tiny to change the world, so but why bother? Similarly, I'm just a very tiny person here. Why should I take climate action? And the problem with I thinking is that I, acting as an individual, cannot make a significant difference to the outcome of climate change. So, why should I bother acting in the first place if change will not come from me acting? So, this raises some central questions. What is the justification for doing my bit as an uninfluential agent, and how can my act be justified as an individual if I am just acting for the purpose of acting and the goal is not to reverse the negative cause of climate change? And then what grounds my actions? Is it the reasons that I have to act, or is it some sort of obligations out there that I have to act? So this particular questions are also very relevant. People have responded, well, we can take reasons-based approaches and we can also take obligation-based approaches. So some responses from the reasons-based approach say that, well, what do we need to do? Julian Nevsky, Shirley Kagan, Derek Pavitt say, well, we can reject the assumption that individual actions are not making any significant difference. And once we reject this as a mistaken assumption, we then start to think that our actions may not really help to necessarily reverse the negative cause of climate change, but it can help. Nevsky particularly says the goal is to help, not necessarily to make a significant difference. So if you understand your actions as your reason for acting as being to help, then you'll not really have much of a problem. And Derek Parfit says, well, it's a moral miscalculation in our moral mathematics. We are calculating it all wrong. And if we understand actions as transcending just significant differences, there are also imperceptible contributions we can make, then we will see that we have some reasons to act. So reasons-based approaches simply give individuals a list of reasons why they should take action on their own, and then that provides the justification for acting in collective harm cases. But there's an influential position that disagrees with these reasons-based approaches, including individual approaches too. And that is where Walter Synod Armstrong comes in. So Walter Synod Armstrong says that, well, there is nothing individuals can do. It is only government that can slow down the negative trend of climate change because they have all the resources at their disposal. And then because of the extractive nature of rich countries in the global north, then these states also have the better resources to solve the problem of climate change without incurring any significant economic cost. And then because of also their exploitation of, poorer countries, they have a special moral obligation to act. And that obligation significantly does not trickle down to any individual members of these rich states. So even if I live under a regime that has some sort of obligation to take climate action, that action does not trickle down to me as an individual because there is not much difference I'm going to make. So even if there is anything individuals can do to contribute to a solution, their actions would be inconsequential. And for these reasons, there is nothing I can do as a person. So the buck again stops at the feet of the state and multinational corporations. And then consequently, Synod Armstrong argues that, well, individuals have neither a moral obligation nor a difference-making justification to take climate action. We should just leave everything for the state to act in this regard. And the argument Walter Synod Armstrong is making rest on two primary assumptions. And the first is that, well, individual climate actions are insufficient to solve the problem collectively, and then also the lack of intention to cause harm. If I set out to drive my SUV on weekends, for example, my goal is not to raise the Earth's global surface temperature. I'm just driving my SUV for fun. So if I have no intention to cause harm, then there's no justification for me to take climate action. That is Synod Armstrong's motivation. But I think there is something wrong with that defense because particularly the condition for attributing responsibility to individual actions, given that there are many factors that come to play when we talk about responsibility. So first, it says, even if I drive my gas guzzler just for fun, for a long time, global warming will occur unless lots of other people also expel greenhouse gases. So my individual climate act is neither necessary nor sufficient. But then we can also think that, well, he does not, Ephraim Hiller says, Senator Armstrong does not provide us with other causes of climate change. So why should we take that argument seriously? And then John Broom says, well, individually inconsequential emissions do expected harm at the end of the day. So we cannot discount those tiny harms that we make generally. But I think that also having a significant cause of relationship with the harms that your actions cause can be something that imposes a responsibility to solve that problem on you. And then there are other ways also you can think about harms that transcends personal causal relationship to the harm. So you can be complicit in wrongdoing without necessarily intending harm. And then also on the argument of the lack of intention to cause harm, we can also say, well, one needn't intend to cause harm generally before you can be responsible, because responsibility can come from foreseeability, can come from knowledge, it can come from complicity, it can also come from relationship and other things. And if we even think of collective harm problems as being a problem that arises from the relationship of different individuals acting together, then that kind of also imposes some sort of complementary responsibility on you to respond to the problem. So when we think of your individual actions, we need to think of it in this context that it exists with the actions of others. So you may be acting alone, but collectively, you lead to certain outcomes that are harmful. And so the response then is that, well, unintentional contribution is not the only way to ground responsibility. So we can just summarize my rejection of these claims that, well, imposition of moral obligations can come from different other foundations. We can ground them in approaches that are different from just simply being directly responsible. And also that the burdens that moral obligations impose on individuals need not be grounded strictly on direct responsibility. So these are factors that are very important. So given these responses, then the question is what other approaches can address this complementary responsibility? If my actions are not going to make any significant difference, then what is the justification for acting? That is where we need to search for a new approach. So the principle that we can search for has to be something that also radically departs from this framework. And if current approaches have been demonstrated to fail, for example, rejecting the mistaken assumption that Nevsky talks about, and also the moral miscalculation of direct profit, well, if reasons for acting are not enough, we need something to motivate people, because the list we are giving people might be too long at the end of the day. Then we need something that grounds or connects individuals to their actions and also to their environment. And that is where we can look at the complementary approach, where Innocent Azuzu gives us some really interesting concept about the relationship of everything to everything. So what can complementary approach do differently? So first, when we talk about the complementary approach, we need to first ask what is complementarity. So Azuzu articulates complementarity as this relationship of mutual dependence among entities. You can think of plants, rivers, rocks, animals, both animate and inanimate things as being collectively interconnected. So everything is connected to everything. And if you understand things as everything has been connected to everything, then from there you can try to generate an idea of what it would mean for me to act as an individual. So what does the complementary framework say? The complementary framework says that, well, to conceive of a characteristically complementary African view of the world is to do so from the prism where we see things as existing in a relationship. And this relationship means that every single person, every single entity and their actions, the structure of their agency is totally connected. It is intertwined. So you cannot separate one thing from the other. And it also means that if you think of that from the aspect of the common good, it also means that the flourishing of a single entity is directly complemented by the flourishing of every other thing that exists within the same environment or within that particular ecosystem. So if you take that complementary thesis to look at how we might grow an obligation, then you're necessarily going to arrive at a framework that looks like this. And first, since I exist in an environment that is complementary in nature, it means that there is something that would be inherently valuable about me as an entity, individual entity. And if there is something valuable about me as a part of this interconnected relationship, the second thesis is related to the first. It means that fulfilling my function or my role within that complementary system is something that is inherently tied to the mutual complementation or relationship that exists between these different units within the system. And that understanding of mutual complementary relationship that exists between things also leads to the third related thesis, which is that for every entity within a particular ecosystem to function properly, there has to be a mutual complementation of relationships, and that also grounds some sort of obligation to do your individual bits within that system for the common good of everything. Because if things go bad for a particular entity, it is going to affect every other entity within that system. So if you can conceptualize what it means to act under this kind of framework, you can think that from the complementary standpoint, to act in a morally relevant way is to feel connected to the subject of one's action. So here, if you think of it in the context of collective action problems where, well, there is a problem of if others are not doing their bit, why should I do mine? So individual climate actions under this framework, you can think of it that when I do my bit as an individual, I am not going to wait for others to do theirs, because as an entity that exists in an interconnected system, my responsibility is not somehow directly tied to what others would do, but on complementing my environment as an entity that is embedded within nature. And the complementary obligation then is grounded on this order regarding values. Order regarding values grounded in relationship of order regarding disposition, like solidarity, like regard for the common good of every other thing that exists in and around me. And this relationship is what binds me to my environment, not necessarily to distant objects in the sense of acting, as you would conceptualize that in collective action cases, but specifically that my first obligation is to do the right thing, to do my bit within where I am embedded in the collective framework of nature. So you can then think, I think, do I have time for, okay. So one might raise an objection to this. So the first objection would be that if we think of the complementary framework that says, well, everything is connected to everything, everything has some sort of significance in this complementary system, then the question that arises would be, given that almost all our actions, have expectations of harm built into them, then how would we justify, you know, certain actions that might lead to harm? For example, does that mean that I'm not going to, ride my bicycle because I might step on an insect, or I'm not going to brush my teeth because if I do that, I'm going to kill millions of microbes? So there is the question of how does this approach, fare in this regard? So I think that a complementary principle of harm would allow some sorts of harms that are unavoidable. For example, we cannot say that the best medical experts should not travel to the DRC currently to help treat the victims of the Ebola virus, simply because if they fly, they are going to emit greenhouse gases. So I think a complementary framework understands that in certain contexts, it might be necessary if that particular course of action is going to lead to the common good of a particular system collectively. So that is one response. So a second objection might also be about what happens in certain communities. So we can think of a consumerist society like in the West, where there is so much emphasis on consumption. The industries keep producing so many articles, and you're constantly bombarded with advertisements to buy these things. So if your habit, your community has certain value systems that are very harmful to the collective well-being of the planet. And complementarity is very big on emphasis on, communal values like order regarding dispositions. How would you respond to that kind of situation, to that kind of context? And I think in contexts as those, that to the extent that an individual entity understands that certain values that are practiced by their community are harmful to the collective well-being of the environment, then an individual might even have a stronger moral obligation, for want of a better word, to rebel against a value system that is antithetical to the common good of the planet and the system. So that would be my response to that second potential objection to the complementary thesis. And then there is also the final potential response that this approach might face, which is that, okay, if obligation swings on promoting the common good of every entity within a complementary system, then it seems that individuals can always point to the collectively insignificant outcomes of the individual contributions and say that, well, if the goal is to fix the environment, if the goal is to reverse the negative trend of climate change, and my action is not going to lead to that common good, then there is no need for me to bother acting in the first place. I might not join everybody else and not do my bit. Well, the salient feature of the complementary principle of action is that my obligation does not depend on difference making. Unlike reasons-based approaches that say you'll be helping to make a difference, difference making seems to be a very significant characteristics of Western approaches or Western grounded approaches. The salient feature of complementarity is that my justification for acting is not dependent on the size of difference I can make collectively, but most importantly, on fulfilling my primary obligations to the environment which I am a part of. So I think this is something that is a salient feature of this approach. So difference making is secondary. The primary thing is my obligation to do my bit within my environment as an entity that is completed by the environment that I find myself. And finally, if we look at this system, we see that unlike all these other approaches, if you give people a list of reasons you'll be helping to solve a problem, well, the goal is to make a difference. You're not going to motivate people to act, because the motivation problem is, how do you establish that there is a relationship between tiny, insignificant persons to a very large, complex system like the planet, that therefore they should take action if they're not going to fix the problem? And then also, um, one thing that is unique about African philosophies generally is that concept of relationship, that concept of everything being connected to everything. And we find out that if people have this sense of being connected to others, have this sense of being connected to the environment, you're more likely going to motivate people to take action if you can establish some sort of connection or relationship between them and the environment. But other approaches simply tell people, well, the environment is some sick creature that is out there, especially the dualistic approach, which says, well, the environment is sick, and your duty is just to act to save this sick environment that is separated from you. But African approaches simply connects you to the environment. So there's that gap that exists in other approaches that doesn't exist here. So the complementary thesis overcomes that problem and establishes that individual actions are more the better alternative in terms of responding to how my actions as an individual can be very effective in this particular large and complex system. Thank you very much. I think I'll stop sharing now.
All right, thank you so much, Ben, for the wonderful presentation. I think I will immediately get to Dr. Nalwamba for her discussion.
Thank you so much, Suzika. Before I start, let me just show my face and then I'll... Hi, everyone. Okay, just to maintain the network in my area. Okay, so thank you so much, Ben. I think I really enjoyed reading your paper, which Paul shared with me. So I think this was a very rich and thought-provoking presentation. So I'd like to commend you for bringing in an African relational framework that is grounded in the principle of complementarity. And what makes this more compelling is not merely that it critiques inconsequentialism as defended by Walter, but that it offers an entirely different understanding of moral agency, responsibility, and human existence in itself. And so, as for me, as someone who's been working with agency and justice-oriented framework like the capability approach, and also with inspiration from works of people like Wangari Maathai, who demonstrate the importance of environmental stewardship as being a communal and a participatory justice-oriented aspect, I actually honestly found your presentation very thoughtful and very meaningful in this time. So at the heart of your presentation, there's a powerful argument that individuals' actions do not exist in isolation. Rather, distinct acts occur within complementary relationships within the actions, not only actions, but also omissions of others. And so moral responsibility cannot be determined solely by whether an individual action independently causes measurable environmental harm or climate harm. Instead, responsibility emerges from the fact that human beings do exist as interconnected participants within a shared space. And so this is very interesting. And because much of mainstream climate ethics research and conversations, especially within Western traditions, are having a lot of this, because even people that we interact with every day, they'll give an excuse to say, I cannot do anything for the environment because what difference does it make? So these are conversations I get to hear almost every day, even as I do my personal freelancing advocacy work. So it's very interesting that you actually worked on such an important conversation altogether. And so when we consider Walter's example, for example, his famous SUV example, in terms of somebody's emission being meaningfully contributing to global climate change. And since the answer appears to be statistically insignificant, the conclusion really is not in terms of how much somebody does, is to an extent said, does it matter what you do or what you do not do? But as your paper correctly argues, such reasoning already presupposes a fragmented understanding of the self as an isolated causal unit that is actually detached from people and also detached from nature. So when I was reading your paper and also just engaging with other literature and other studies, three main things stand out for me. The first one is that you challenge individual irrelevance in climate ethics, because Ben critiques Walter's view that individuals bear little moral responsibility to climate harm due to the negligible impact. But then the main question now shifts to from do or did my action cause harm? And then we move to asking, like, am I fulfilling my moral role within a community that faces collective harm? And then the other thing is that your paper introduces the concept of complementary obligation, which argues that ethical responsibility arises from being part of a network of mutual dependence. And so individual actions matter not just for their consequences, but because they participate in the collective moral order at the end of the day. And so this also speaks a lot to how the Ubuntu, for example, we speak to the fact that I am because we are. So it goes beyond the self. So I found that quite profound. And then the third one is you addressing and a form of criticizing and decolonizing environmental philosophy, because your thoughtful, your presentation and your paper responds to the overgeneration objection that morality could become over demanding if every action is scrutinized. If we're going to count, say, what do I do? What difference does it make? If I'm being critical at every stage that I do, it means at the end of the day, people will actually decide not to act at all. But what are we saying in all this? The moral question is no longer simply whether my isolated action as Daisy changes the outcome in a measurable way. Rather, the question becomes whether my conduct contributes or undermines the harmonious relational order that sustains collective flourishing. So in your framework, actions possess moral significance not only because of their outcomes, but because they express our participation in this network of mutual dependence and also a shared experience and existence, not only as humans, but also with nature, with the biophysical environment. And I also find that this relational grounding of obligation, as you put it, is particularly important in climate ethics, especially in dealing with the notion of the feeling of insignificance in itself, the feeling of insignificance in itself. Many people reason that if billions of others continue polluting the environment, then their own sacrifices do not matter. And I think this also came out strongly even throughout my PhD research. So I was very, very interested, even as I read your paper and just followed your argument altogether. And so so it does, your paper does offer a compelling response to this pessimism. It does do that to a larger extent. Then the other thing is that I also appreciate your broader contribution to global philosophy, because too often African philosophical traditions are treated as culturally interesting, but maybe not that's interesting philosophically, or they are regarded as secondary to Western frameworks. So your paper does challenge this tendency of the way we look at African philosophy, especially in responding to environmental crisis and environmental harm. Your paper does demonstrate that African philosophy is not merely descriptive or symbolic, but it's capable of coming up or generating rigorous conceptual tools that are relevant for attending or addressing urgent environmental needs that we continue to face today beyond Africa, actually. And then also importantly, there's also a notion that there's a rejection of reciprocity as a necessary condition for obligation. Many theories of collective action collapse when others refuse to cooperate. Even just from our individualistic point of view, there's a sense of, okay, I'm doing this, but to what extent? I'm the only Zambian maybe concerned with this, but to what extent? So these are very critical questions, but they do matter because they're the ones that are shaping how we are addressing or adapting to the climate crisis in general. So the complementary framework resists this moral paralysis by grounding obligation in relational existence rather than in contingent cooperation. So your paper does move beyond anthropocentrism. It moves beyond all that. So we're looking at trees, rivers, plants, little birds, the ecosystem in general, not merely looked at as a resource for human use, but we're looking at that as part of something that is connected to our moral order or our moral existence as human beings. And it does resonate with the very cause for environmental stewardship that are coming up strongly, and with African scholars as well coming in within the conversation. And so I think your paper is very important, and it does critique, it does offer a critique of hyper individualism, extractive modernity, and also ecologically destructive models of development. But then it also calls for certain questions and reflections that I would want to share with you. Those you can respond to would be great, and then the rest you can just reflect on them in your time. The first one is in terms of further exploring how complementarity navigates or addresses conflicts between environmental protection and economic survival, especially for vulnerable communities, because many communities in the global south and even beyond, we depend on anthropogenic activities that harm the environment at a very high rate. But how does this framework effectively address the tensions between ecological responsibility and the urgent need for development that Africa, for example, faces currently? Does it offer actual or effective guidance in terms of how we can balance this sustainability core with the questions of economic justice and also post-colonial inequalities that have existed? Then the other question is, if responsibility is complementary, then governments, as Walter was arguing, then governments, corporations, and international institutions may possess relational obligations, but not just as individuals. But then in terms of the institutional and policy application of this framework, how can this principle of complementarity be applied at institutional or policy levels? Because we are talking beyond individuals. And so the other one is, because climate change is a global problem, but then moral systems are very culturally diverse and they're shaped by various cultural aspects within our space. So can complementarity successfully support global climate cooperation across societies with totally different moral traditions? I don't know what to think about that. And then my last question would be, considering the polluter pays principle, which I'm very passionate about, because countries like Zambia experience a lot of pollution, but that is all grounded on economic development. But then the voices of the marginalized and those mainly affected are actually very silent. But then considering the aspects of the polluter pays principle and also climate-induced injustices, do you think that emphasizing shared responsibility risks weakening accountability for major polluters or for major emitters? Because if everyone participates in this collective harm, we are all concerned about the collective harm, and how do we prevent major emitters from hiding behind, quote unquote, the idea of shared responsibility? So lastly, I think your presentation is very timely, and at the heart of the climate crisis is really this major ethical problem, which is climate change is caused collectively, but its harms are distributed unequally, which is our realities even in country within Zambia and beyond the African continent and even beyond the continent itself. So at a time when the climate crisis and the discourse is increasingly threatened by this very belief that individual actions do not matter, I think your presentation does remind us that moral responsibility is not suspended simply because our contributions may appear small. I am a firm believer that my contributions do not appear small. Instead, our humanity may be realized precisely through those very actions that could sustain harmony, dignity, well-being, and agency in the world that we share these resources, and therefore we also have these burdens that come upon us. So I think your presentation was very, very interesting, and I think I'll continue to engage with it even post this BBT. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nalwamba. At this point, I'll take it back to you, Ben. If you could respond quickly in a few minutes, and then we could open it up for questions and comments from online and in the room. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Daisy. I think that was flawless. That was a very beautiful analysis, summary, and very relevant questions. So let me address some of your relevant questions here. So you say, can complementarity work at global cooperation level? And how can it be applied at the institutional level? So I think the first thing or distinction I need to make is that there are two primary responses. There is the collective action approach, which says, well, we can act collectively, and then there is the individual action. And my work is particularly focused on individual response. So I acknowledge that, well, states, corporations, multinational organizations, IPCC, all of them have responsibility. They can act at that level, multinational, multilateral, institutional level. But my primary question was about what can I, whilst waiting for these corporations to act, what can I do as a person? Do I have some sort of responsibility to maybe I fly to 10 countries in a year? Can I cut that down to just 2 relevant countries? Very important. Can I give up my SUV like Synod Armstrong's gas guzzler driver who drives on weekends for fun? Can I just take public transport if I have a very efficient public transport system in my city? Can I give up my SUV? Um, can I also cut down on the level of consumption? Can I become a minimalist if that is what is going to take to reduce the carbon footprint on the planet? So, my primary points of departure was actually what individuals can do. So, I think that does not in any way absolve corporations and multinational organizations and states, rich states of responsibility at that level. So, that's the first one. So, um, there is the question of polluter pays principle. Do you think emphasizing complementary responsibility will shield corporations and rich states? Well, it is true, like Walter Synod Armstrong argues, that rich states have been at the forefront of all the greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, I think Manchester here has been this is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. So, richer states have been emitting tons of CO2s for the past 300 years now. So, a bulk of a responsibility rests on the shoulders of these giant economies. So, that responsibility still exists. And I am not trying to shield them, but I think if these states were also to have individuals who think in complementary terms, then these states would also be motivated to start taking these climate actions at the state level. The problem we have with the Paris Climate Accord and the rest has been this coordination problem we talk about again with collective action, where the state wants to cut down emissions, but it's not fully committed because everybody's committed to growth. Everybody's trying to grow their GDP at the end of the day. So because of that, there is that conflict of interest. And because state B will not act, state B says, why should I be the only one acting? So if we were to think in complementary terms that as an individual state, first and foremost, I have a responsibility to do what is right to the environment that I belong, then that complementary thinking, maybe the ripple effects can grow outside the boundaries of particular states and also trickle down to these multinational corporations. And states still have their responsibility. I am in no way saying they should be shielded from that responsibility. On that aspect, I support Walter Synod Armstrong that yes, they still bear that responsibility. But where I depart is saying that, well, as an individual, because my action is not going to make any significant difference to the outcome collectively, because of that, I should abdicate my responsibility and sit on the sidelines and keep driving my SUV and saying, well, the buck stops at the feet of states. It is the responsibility of states to take climate action, not me as an individual. And then your very also important point about how complementary to response to tensions between our commitment to both ecological responsibility and economic survival. Yeah, in Africa and much of the global south or the majority world, we have this situation where we are largely the underdeveloped parts of the world. We are still developing, as they would say, we are still building infrastructure. So because these other richer states exploited these countries in resources, extractive capitalism, imperialism, took all the resources from these places to develop this part of the world. One might say, well, now these states are comfortable. The public infrastructure, the are already built, everything is efficient. So they might have reasons to take climate actions because they are not trying to build roads, they are not trying to deliver pipeline water to their community and all that. So they are not going to destroy much of the environment again. So should poorer countries just give up their own developmental objectives simply because they want to fit into the system? Well, that is where I was talking about that in some contexts, we can think of complementarity as giving some room for necessary harm if it is necessary for the common good, if that is what is necessary for the foundation of the common good. For example, I don't think we would say a poor community in the global south, or whether here in Manchester, that if we were to have a poor community where there is no pipe-borne water, that people cannot, connect water, build water infrastructure, because it is going to kill some insect in that community. Because if people also drink untreated water, then people are going to get sick, people are going to die, and that is going to be harm in itself to the collective well-being of entities within that environment, because human beings are not separated from this nature. They are also entities within nature. So if that living conditions is a kind of context that is going to harm both entities that exist in that environment, which includes humans, we might think of it as being, well, complementarily necessary that we allow that action in that case. So I think the farmer herders clashes and all that kind of economic situations that might necessitate some sort of causing harm to a few things to improve the collective well-being might be permissible under the complementary framework, because complementarity would not be a very reasonable philosophy if it were to condemn human beings to death and suffering, because it is trying to tell people, well, don't cause harm to the environment, just exist like that. So thank you very much.
All right. Ben, I think I see you loving the exchange with David there. But we're running out of time, so we have about 9 minutes more. I'll just maybe I should tend to the people in the room and online if there's anybody would like to say something. If not, then you can get back to Daisy. But for now, if there's a question, a comment in the room, and for those online, please, it's your time to ask. Any questions? So that I don't look like I stopped Ben from speaking for no reason. Yes, please.
Perhaps I will motivate some people to ask questions. Thank you, Ben, for your presentation. And thank you, Daisy, for the reflection. I mean, both of you complemented each other well in this sense. My question is simple, I guess. It is whether it is realistic for, on the one hand, an industrial society to want to slow down on industrialization just because they want to, of course, importantly, they want to work on the climate change, want to reduce emission and the problems that come with it. On the other hand, countries and societies that want to industrialize, and then the fear and the concern of the climate change is there. Is it realistic for them to slow down? So I just thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question, please.
I can piggyback on that as well. I'm just concerned about, like what Paul was saying, is this whole thing with AI, and it really resonates with a very destructive. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's coming through, but not very clear, but I'm trying.
Whole AI space that we're in, and the way it's advancing, and the way it's advancing hinges on a lot of extractive depletion of a lot of natural resources. How are people going to wrestle with that tension? AI is here to stay, and people like AI.
Okay, I think maybe you can also attend to we have a question online from Melanie. So maybe when she asks that, then you can respond to the three.
Thanks very much, Patrick. That was really very, very interesting and very, very well presented. I've got two questions which really build on what Paul and Fadzai are saying. I'm curious about the issue of values, because in terms of moving away from these extractivist economies, the move to AI, which has already shown to be using masses and masses and massive amounts of water and so on. So how do people's values shift? I mean, would you see it as grounded in this relational philosophy? But if you're not subscribing to that relational philosophy, then what happens? And then the other question related to that is the issue about where power and power relations fit into your framework. So I'm very, very attracted and very taken with the notion of how do you put it, sort of challenging the notion of insignificant and small actions, not mattering. But there are issues of values and how values change or don't change. And the power, in fact, of consumerist values, which I think that's just so powerful in the majority in the global north, and then how you deal with power in your analysis. But thank you very much, and I have to say also, Daisy, that was a really excellent response. So thank you to both of you.
All right, thank you. So Ben, we have about only 4 minutes. So I think you will take that time to respond, because I'm not so sure we'll have any time after. Thank you.
Oh, all right. So to the first question, about is it realistic for industrial societies to give up? I think one thing I like to think in terms of like Michael Parenti, the American Marxist, would say, capitalism is one of the most successful propaganda of the last 400 years. There is nothing really fundamentally healthy about this ideology. It is a propaganda. What we need is actually a decolonization of this propaganda, that this is not the way to live, because an idea has been popular and we advertise it to ourselves and then we relish that idea for so long does not mean that we can think of a society that can thrive on a model that is not inherently tied to consumption, endless consumption and industrialization. And in some environmental circles, people have been preaching a lot about degrowth. Why are we so obsessed with GDP? At the end of every year, we want to see 1%, 2% GDP, but we tend to, really get to the margins, the most important thing about the quality of human life, how human beings relate to the environment and all that. So I think it is very much realistic, the same way the propaganda of capitalism was sold to people for hundreds of years and people bought it. I think this is where individuals and states also have, especially African countries and other global south countries, have also a complementary obligation to start selling the idea or the propaganda. It is not actually propaganda. In fact, complementarity is even grounded in facts, because we are entities that are embedded within nature. But capitalism, the idea of exploitation and the idea of the dualism between human beings and nature, is actually a propaganda, because we are not separated from nature. Nature is not some entity that exists out there and needs to be constantly exploited and destroyed in order for us to grow some numbers on the fiscal budgets every year. All right, so to the other questions about AI, the tension between the proliferation of AI technologies and also environmental destruction. And I think AI, has been consuming a lot of. I think in the United States recently, we've had loads of complaints about communities complaining about their water sources getting polluted and destroyed because of these massive AI data centers that are springing up everywhere. I think that that is also a product of this capitalist propaganda. Every single human being and entity on earth needs a clean water to survive. But we've been surviving, we've been around since the cognitive revolution 70,000 years ago without data centers. In fact, data centers are not so healthy. It is still built into this consumerist culture where we have to constantly consume. What exactly is the value of these AI data centers we keep parroting about every day? It is a propaganda that has been sold that it is the next best thing. If you pick up, for example, pieces of artwork that are generated by AI and pieces of artwork that are painted by the local artists in your street, you can see the reality, you can see the difference, that the one painted by a human being is still better, but somebody needs to sell this it's like a fetish that no, if it comes from this AI technology, it is the next best thing. We don't need it because of the disruption it causes to the environment. So we need to start, in fact, attacking this idea at the source for what it is, which is that it is a very destructive propaganda to the environment. And the responsibility, again, still lies with us who think that we don't have power when actually we do. And then the second question about the power relations between if I am an individual, or let's say I'm also a small country, let's say I'm a country of 1 million people or 500,000 people, what significance, what kind of influence can I make? But then this also borders on the argument of Walter Synod Armstrong, who says the reason why individuals cannot take or should not bother about taking action is because they are uninfluential. But if you look at Synod Armstrong's work, there is some place where he says, well, individuals can then start working to, advocate, meet local politicians to start taking actions because those are really the people with influence. But the question is, if you believe that I, as an individual, I am uninfluential, then how am I going to be influential in getting the local politicians to enact laws and policies that are going to be beneficial to the environment? So it's kind of a contradictory thinking in the first place. I think individuals are not so uninfluential as we like to think ourselves to be. What we need is actually to kind of be committed to a particular philosophy, and that is a philosophy that everything is connected to everything, and not a dualistic philosophy that kind of separates human beings from the environment and make us to look at the environment as something that exists out there. Because just like Lynn White said in 1967 about the whole Judeo-Christian theology separating humans from the environment and being responsible for the entire environmental destruction, we see that in order for this idea that destruction of the environment to thrive so that we can get ChatGPT to generate silly, repetitive, monotonous text for us is simply because if it is generated by machine, it is good. But we see that writings that are done by human beings are still more profound. They send messages that human beings can relate to more than the repetitive things that are regurgitated by all these artificial intelligence platforms. So it is an ideology that needs to be attacked at the very root, at the very source. And I think that will be my response. We need to attack the propaganda from the source. There is nothing that ChatGPT is going to do to improve the conditions of human beings. In fact, a recent research just shows that it is making people to become dumber, more stupid. So there is nothing this thing is adding to our lives as a collective. We need to attack the propaganda for what it is. Thank you.
All right. All right. Thank you so much, Ben and Daisy. We had a good time, and thank you everyone for joining, those online and those in the room. Goodbye. All right.